Thank you very much, Magdi. So there are a lot of trials that have occurred in the last decade, and this is just a sampling of them. If you look at the timeline on the horizontal axis, I mean, HeartMates, Thoratex, Novacors, up through 2013, CardioWest, Abiacor. And now, as we just heard, that there are other devices on the horizon. So I'm going to take you briefly through some of the trials that are ongoing in the United States to give you a glimpse at the direction of the field. So the HeartMate 3. This is another Thoratec product. It has some distinct advantages. It's a compact magnetically levitated pump. Theoretically, it may have more resistance to thrombosis because of the textured surfaces inside the pump chamber. That remains to be proven. Clinical trials in the United States are already being planned and will be underway in late 2013. There is one important advantage of the HeartMate 3. The driveline is modular, which means that if there are developed cracks or defects in the driveline, there is a greater probability that it can be repaired at the bedside rather than requiring removal of the entire pump. So then there are other developments from Thoratec in the line of miniaturization. So they are, like other companies, developing a platform of miniaturized pumps, and they're in the design phase of the so-called HeartMate X, again focusing on the RVAD, BiVAD situation, in which pumps can be placed in smaller patients. Theoretically, this pump, which is shown here diagrammatically, that's the HeartMate 2, and this is the so-called HeartMate X. Implanted in the biventricular position here. There is some evidence to believe that the projected lifespan theoretically would be very much longer, lower power consumption from smaller external batteries. They also are working on this energy transfer systems, which will eliminate a driveline. I'm going to show you some information a little bit later on the likelihood of infections with drivelines as they currently exist. So this will be a major advance forward if it actually works out. So Thoratec is one of several companies which are developing their own version of percutaneous energy transfer without any external driveline. The Jarvik pump. This is the Jarvik 2000 has been around for really many years. They actually have the longest surviving patient with the Jarvik 2000. They have a particularly patented cone bearings, which allegedly have greater durability, a large number of implants. So the pivotal trial in bridge to transplant therapy has already been completed in the United States. And they are making plans for their destination therapy, that is permanent placement of the Jarvik 2000. This is a study which will employ randomization against the HeartMate 2. One interesting thing about the Jarvik pump, it's the only pump that has a post-auricular version of the driveline exit, and this has important theoretical advantages. A number of studies have indicated greater patient satisfaction with this because they're able to do things like showering and bathing nearly normally compared to other pumps with percutaneous drivelines. Jarvik has developed a series of pumps. There's an adult pump, a so-called child, and then an infant pump. And of course, these are being, like other companies, fashioned for biventricular support. Now, here's another pump which I think has one major disadvantage. Everhard, I've visited their factories in Japan, and it has a very attractive feature of having this continuous lubricating system which theoretically will increase the longevity of their bearings. But the big disadvantage is this is quite a bulky pump, and the whole world is going towards smaller and less invasive incisions, smaller pumps. So we'll see if the EVA can show enough advantages in durability or freedom from thrombosis that it can prevail. Total artificial heart. So there's another trial coming with a Syncardia device. Of course, currently the 70cc pump, Syncardia, is what's on the market, and that's approved for bridge to transplant therapy in the United States. They now also have developed the 50cc Syncardia pump, which is a smaller pump down to about 1 meter square body surface area, which will potentially be applicable for adolescents and is quite attractive to the pediatric world. And it's thought the trials will begin in about 2014 in the United States for the Syncardia 50cc pump. Heartware. Heartware is really one of the up-and-coming companies in the United States. Their HVAD was just approved in 2012 as bridge to transplant therapy. And the next thing coming from Heartware, of course, is the MVAD. This is getting a lot of favorable publicity. It's a third the size of the HVAD, so it's very small, applicable for the pediatric population as well as for smaller adults, biventricular position, and so on. Plans are currently for, after the first patients for CE marking in Europe are initiated, then they will probably begin trials in the United States. This is the configuration. This happens to be 2 HVADs, but the MVADs will be even smaller versions of this, which will be very suitable for biventricular support. Now, they also have a transcutaneous energy transfer system. So Heartware has a little different version than Thoratec, but multiple companies are really concentrating on eliminating the percutaneous driveline because there is a very major potential for infection. I'll review that data with you in the next discussion. And that is, when you talk to patients, that is a major source of quality of life dissatisfaction. And so I believe clearly that within the next 3 to 5 years, both Thoratec and Heartware systems will have a transcutaneous energy transfer system, which will be a major MCS advance. So very briefly, right ventricular support. Abiomed is really paving the way in the United States for right ventricular support on a temporary basis. I'll show you more information about the problems of biventricular failure after VAD implantation, but this is the so-called Impella RP trial, which is now beginning in the United States. This is a catheter-based system in which the device is implanted through the femoral vein, inserted up into the heart and sits in the pulmonary artery, so the inflow is in the inferior vena cava, outflow in the pulmonary artery. This does not allow active ambulation, but it is good for several days at least while the right ventricle is recovering, and of course could be used for up to a month. So what about pumps for so-called less sick patients? Because the whole field is beginning to examine so-called equipoise and applying pump technology to patients who are not quite seriously ill on inotropes or rapidly deteriorating. We call it intermax levels 4 through 7. That is either the lower stages of class 4 heart failure or advanced class 3. So there are a couple of pump device companies which are really focusing on these, and Circulite is really one of the major ones. They have a beautiful small pump which is now just being introduced into the United States. The Circulite Synergy, which is the size of a AA battery. They tout its ability to be implanted in a so-called limited access way. That would be, I suppose, in the eyes of the beholder, but it does require a small thoracotomy, sits in a pacemaker-like pocket, and as I said, is good for class 3B and early class 4. It does not provide 10 liters of flow, though. It only provides up to about 4.25 liters of flow, so you have to have some native cardiac output as well. It is a little bit unique in that the inflows from the left atrium and the outflows into the subclavian artery. There is some controversy about exactly how effective this will be, but this pump will be, as I said, entering clinical trials in the United States within the next year. Another device, which is for class 3 patients, which has been undergoing clinical trials in the United States for the last several years, and they're completing these trials now, is not an internal pump, but an external device, really a counterpulsation device, similar to the intra-aortic balloon pump, but it provides external counterpulsation. The Sunshine Heart C-Pulse, as it's called, and this is an external wrap around the ascending aorta, and this provides a counterpulsation effect. And of course, there's no contact between the surfaces of the pump and the bloodstream. There have been some reported infections and erosions of the aorta with this pump, which can be fatal, but they're very uncommon. And so there is at least some enthusiasm in some quarters for chronic counterpulsation for class 3 patients. Revive it. So in the United States, over the past 3 years, there's been an ongoing controversy between certain segments of the device community, of the VAD community, if you will, and the National Institutes of Health as to when real equipoise would be achieved to start a formal long-term therapy, destination therapy, in patients who actually weren't yet sick enough for a heart transplant. This has gradually evolved into the Revive It trial. I would not say there's uniform agreement that there's equipoise here yet, but the momentum is strong, and likely this trial will start enrolling patients toward the end of 2013. And the elements are that this is a randomized trial against medical therapy. Now you notice that in this slide it says the HeartMate 2. The initial proposal was for a Heartware. And it was a little strange in the United States because they were proposing a study when it was actually selected by the NIH to use a device which was not yet approved for bridge to transplant therapy. It was mystifying. But the advantages of the Heartware seemed so significant that they actually approved a pump which was not approved for bridge to transplant therapy to be approved to begin a trial for destination therapy in less sick patients. So there was a little bit of a sort of a lapse in logic there. Eventually that concern became great enough that they actually disqualified the Heartware pump and renegotiated with Thoratec to have the pump being what many feel is the inferior HeartMate 2 instead of the Heartware. So it's all quite interesting. So these are patients who, as I said, do not qualify for transplant, not sick enough. There'll be 100 randomized patients to either HeartMate 2 or medical therapy. Probably will be starting in 2013, later this year. Now there's another study that was actually started in response to Revive It when Revive was using the Heartware, which is a roadmap study. It really was intended to keep Thoratec in the game, if you will, being visible for patients who are less sick. And so now Thoratec's dominating both of these studies, in which is a non-randomized observational study in which centers who elect to apply device therapy for less sick patients, so-called Intermex levels 4 through 6, and then they will be following either those patients or optimal medical management patients in those institutions. They're looking also up to about 200 patients. So just in the last couple of minutes, I want to just mention a few things about other ways in which we can gain information other than strictly through clinical trials. So Intermax has spun off a number of other entities to try and collect this kind of information, and Medimax is an important one. We need a medical arm in which we can follow these patients as carefully as they're followed within Intermax. And so the NIH has sponsored a pilot trial of medical patients in so-called levels 4 through 7, that is less sick class 4 patients, to help refine the selection of patients in the crucial range of ambulatory heart failure. where the benefit of VAD therapy could be the greatest. And emerging pediatric devices, there's also great interest. The NIH has actually spent over $24 million in setting up the so-called Pumpkin Trial, encouraging innovation. And this trial began in 2004 with taking proposals for these devices. It's likely that it may start a clinical trial in patients within the next year. But the sad news is that there originally were 2 durable pumps, one of which was the PediaFlow pump, but the company decided not to pursue this further, and so currently, along with some ECMO circuits, which are temporary, the main player in this is going to be the Jarvik heart for durable long-term support. So that will include prominently this 12 millimeter infant Jarvik version. Again, there also is a Circulite, which will not be part of the Pumpkin Trial, but they also have a miniature pump which has an apical implant site in it and an outflow to the ascending aorta. So in response to the small numbers at any given institution, the NIH also has made a commitment to getting pediatric devices into this database, and so PediMax was formed, and PediMax really is an NIH-sponsored subset of InterMax. It will have younger patients less than 19 years of age. We have elected to include also temporary pumps in this database, some modification of the adverse event definitions and the quality of life instruments, but basically it's going to follow the template of InterMax. So we're hoping to get enough patients in this in the United States and potentially elsewhere so that we can get valuable information from centers who would only be doing 2 or 3 or 4 implants at a given center, but on a multi-institutional level might provide useful information. Thanks very much.